Well, I think we're got a good group of folks here. So I'll go ahead and get us started. I want to welcome everyone to our Advocacy in Action webinar. Appreciate you all taking the time out of your busy summer Tuesdays to be with us and not be watching the World Cup. Sorry to drag you away from that, but we're glad you're all here. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Chris Martin. I'm the Director of Public Policy here with Connections for the Homeless. I lead our statewide policy and advocacy efforts alongside some great community partners who you're going to hear from here today. Um, at Connections, we work to end homelessness one person, one policy, and one system at a time. Alongside providing housing and wraparound supportive services, we also advocate for policies that expand access to affordable housing and create lasting systemic change. And today's conversation is an important part of that work. It's an exciting time for us at Connections. This was our first real year getting involved in state legislative work. We had our first sourced bill this year from Representative Kevin Olacall, HB 5394, which we'll probably talk about in a bit. But it's also an exciting time for me to be joining Connections. I spent the last 8 years working on statewide policy in California around housing and homelessness. But I'm thrilled to be back here in Illinois as I am a native Illinoisan from Schaumburg, Illinois. Before we jump in, just a quick housekeeping notes. We're recording this webinar. It'll be shared with you all. If you registered for today's session, everyone will receive it. You'll also have the chance to provide questions for us throughout the presentation. We'll try and catch those as they come and also leave time at the end to try and get to the ones that we didn't throughout. With that being said, we'll get started. And now that the legislative session has ended, today's discussion will take a closer look at what happened this session, what these outcomes mean for our communities across Illinois, and where we go from here. But I'll take a chance to let our panelists, before we jump right in, introduce themselves. We got a great group of folks here today, and I'll kick it over to Naya to get us started.
Hi, thanks so much, Chris. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Naya Kelly, she, her pronouns. I am the Director of State Legislative Policy, Equity, and Transformation. Am I supposed to dig in a little bit about who I am, or I can just go ahead and pass it on?
Can you share a little
No, okay, well, you all know who I am, so I will go ahead and pass it on. I know we only have so much
bit?
time, so I'll go ahead and pass it over to Max.
Hey everyone, good to see you all. I'm Max Seeley, he, him. I'm Director of Government Affairs at the Supportive Housing Providers Association, or SHPA. I also, prior to this role, worked for Connections on the advocacy team for about 3 years. And I will pass it over to Bob.
And I am Bob Palmer. I'm the Policy Director and Housing Action Illinois, and glad to be here with our partners here on the panel. And good to see so many friends and allies that we know, and I know others know, looking at the participants list.
Great. Thank you all for being here. Maybe we'll start with a little orientation of kind of the legislative session, how it works. And I'm curious, Max, if you could speak a little bit to the general timeline and how the introduction timeline, passage of the budget, and how those things play out through the year.
Yeah, so the main legislative session each year runs from the beginning of January all the way to the wee hours of May 31st, sometimes rolling over into June 1st a little bit. But that is the main time where work is being done in Springfield. The session usually starts first or second week of January, especially this upcoming year because we're having elections in November. That'll be the start of a brand new 2 year General Assembly. So all of the legislators will get sworn back in. That's when we'll start seeing new bills being introduced for this upcoming 105th General Assembly. Usually, first week of February is the bill introduction deadline, which means all of the bills that for the most part can be considered that spring would need to be introduced by the first week of February. For the budget in particular, that usually kicks off more in the middle of February when the governor presents his State of the State and budget address to both the House and Senate. He releases the proposed budget from the governor's office, which kind of serves as a starting point for the General Assembly to then take that proposed budget and edit it to meet the needs of our state. This all kind of culminates with committee deadlines, and other things that I know Bob's gonna speak more about in a little bit. And in Illinois, for things to take effect on July 1. So remember, session ends May 31st. For things to take effect that upcoming July 1, so 2 weeks ago, it needs to be passed by May 31st unless they get a super majority of votes. So really everything kind of comes to a head right the last few weeks of May where business needs to get done before people go home for the summer.
Yeah, you were starting to hit on it there, Max. I'm curious now if you could speak to like when does most of the work happen? When does most of the action get really rolling in the legislature?
Yeah, I think it's depending on what items are we're talking about. So, I teach concerning Illinois legislature and policy. And one of the things I always talk about is that there is this pick your path kind of way of looking at how bills are introduced, kind of the way that Max was talking about it. And there are set parliamentary rules as well as constitutional rules about how and when things need to be passed. But oftentimes, when you're talking about big, lofty packages, it may be an omnibus or something that is a hot topic. Right now, we're thinking about artificial intelligence. Oftentimes, those kind of conversations will be happening in the background, weekly meetings or bi-weekly meetings, and we'll see a package come out that last week of session when we're talking about the the budget. Oftentimes it's again at the end of session. I say working on the budget is one of the most it's one of those things you don't know if you passed or if you succeeded until the day or a day or two before the end of session. You could have done 5 or 6 months of work, or you may have done a year worth of work because right now people are in the process of developing their ask for this next year. But you won't know until the budget bill drops or the budget implementation bill drops whether or not you succeeded. And so it is dependent on um, what how important an issue is, how audacious it is, and even if a bill is something that is simple, I don't know about Bob and Max, but I have never had a bill do go around the traditional trajectory of like first reading, second reading, third reading, go to the second chamber, and then goes to the governor's office. I always have to repeat a step of some sort. I'm sure someone has that experience. In my almost 11 years in this work, I've never had a bill that start to finish did the traditional schoolhouse rock, like first, second, third governor's office.
Yeah, I'm curious, maybe Bob, if you could just expand upon that. Like how would a bill go through the legislative process and maybe even adding in the experience we've all had with that Naya just mentioned, where you're bouncing back and forth between committee and floor.
Yes, well, Naya used the schoolhouse rock metaphor, which I was going to do, but so I won't do that. But I agree with what Naya said, and what Max said is very important. There's the schedule and the deadlines on the official um, calendar, which there are various parliamentary rules, and those can be worked around in various ways, at least if you have support of the leaders in the majority um, in the House and/or Senate. Um, a lot of it has to do with what opposition there is to legislation that's being introduced. I'm sure we'll talk about that more on some specific bills, particularly for bills where there's a lot of opposition. There will be often negotiations between the proponents and the opponents, and then you'll have amendments. Bills can go back to uh, committee, two or three times before they're ready for a vote by the full chamber. Um, Also, sometimes, and this has happened to me in the past session, I'm sure it's happened to everyone who's worked on bills in this meeting, where you wind up having like a totally different bill number because maybe you're working on um, negotiating a bill and getting it through at the very end of session and use a different bill number to be able to make use of the parliamentary rules to allow it to pass um, quicker. So it's very hard to summarize. And again, the simple way that looks on the flow chart um, generally or very rarely happens unless it's a bill where there's essentially no opposition. So.
I'm wondering if you all could speak to, as we led into this session and this legislative year, and maybe early on, what kind of some of the themes you heard were going into this legislative session. Whoever wants to jump in.
I think affordability was the main topic of this session in terms of um, just whether it is with groceries or it's healthcare or housing. All of the connectors were thinking about affordability. I will pass it on to my colleagues. There are a couple more I think we could chat about.
Yeah, I mean, I think a related one, but another really important was just the impacts that the first year of the Trump administration has had, especially on social services, homeless services in particular. After the 2025 spring session ended is when HR 1 got signed into law. So for the most part, the Illinois General Assembly really didn't have a big opportunity to address the very hard questions that HR 1 is putting our state through until this session. So that's, how do we address work requirements for SNAP and Medicaid, people losing access, people, who are really struggling to get by, making it harder for them to catch up and become self-sufficient and reach stability. So throughout the session, that was really a big topic of conversation is how our state can protect ourselves from a rogue federal government.
And I'll just say that obviously there are a lot of state budget challenges for a whole host of reasons, including especially um, the federal level Trump administration dynamics. And we came out of two fiscal years in the not too distant past FY24 and FY25, where the state budget situation, pretty rare for Illinois, was in a good position, and we were able to successfully advocate for budget increases in those years. But the last couple years, FY26 had just completed, and FY27 that just started a much more challenging fiscal outlook, and it's been much harder to advocate for increases, and we've had to spend time um, opposing budget cuts.
Yeah, really helpful context. I'm curious if you all could speak to some of the priorities that your organization had going into this year, and maybe kind of what came of those top priorities as the year went on. Maybe
Yeah,
starting, Max, you want to start us?
yeah, I can start off, for all of us who are on this call, for those who are attending the webinar, I think funding for homeless services obviously is pretty high up on our priority list. like we were just speaking about, we know that work requirements for Medicaid and SNAP keep people from accessing the benefits that they are entitled to from our federal government. That puts people at greater risk of housing insecurity. Additionally, this past November, HUD put out a new grant opportunity for the Continuum of Care program, which is the main vehicle that funds homeless services from the federal level. This grant opportunity included many blatantly illegal policy changes to the program, including capping funding for permanent housing at 30% when the previous level had been up to 90% of funding available for permanent housing. So really going into session as we start talking about the state budget, it's about ensuring that people who are facing homelessness have the support and structure that they need, and that happens when providers across the state have funding to be able to meet that need. That has been an ongoing challenge in the state of Illinois. In the past couple years, as COVID dollars became available, we have seen a significant increase in funding for homeless services. Despite this, as a state, we are still far behind our peers in funding for homeless services going back to fiscal year 2000. We have not even caught up to where we were 26 years ago now in terms of funding for social services. So it's a paradigm that needs to change. We need to be able to fund homeless services. So that's really what we were focused on and working with great partners like Bob and Naya to advocate for that throughout session.
I can go next. For us, alongside the work alongside SHIPA and Housing Action for CCH, our big focus was on homeless education. So for folks who may not be familiar, at the federal level, we receive funding to support students experiencing homelessness or students living in temporary living situations. Under McKinney-Vento, with the changes that are happening at the federal level, it now is the time for us to really be thinking about how we best um, inoculate our state and make sure that students here are will still retain access to services. We're one of the only states in the nation that has a companion McKinney-Vento Act, and so that's something we're really proud of. But we had to put our money where our mouth is, and so this year we asked for $5 million to support homeless education, where those funds could be used on transportation, which we know is one of the biggest concerns for school districts. But we've also seen some unique things happen with COVID related funding, including school districts buying washer and dryers or remodeling their showers so that students could come in and do laundry and take showers, hiring social workers so that there is a dedicated person on staff to support students who are experiencing homelessness. We had Representative Favor Dias in the House and Senator Lakeisha Collins in the Senate as our champions on these. And like I said, you don't know you want until the end of session. And so in Amendment 3 of the budget, we were able to see that $2 million was included for homeless education. And so that is a huge win. We have not funded that at a state level since 2010, and we reestablished that line item 3 years ago with the support of Representative Mussman and Senator Villa, but also in terms of our work around homeless and housing advocacy. I just want to give a shout out to Senator Johnson as well as Representative LaPointe, who really carried the mantle on this work this year.
Bob, did you want to hit on any housing actions priorities this year?
Sure. Obviously, Connections for the Homeless webinar. We're talking a lot about homelessness today, and that's one of Housing Action Illinois' key priorities. And we always partner with SHIPA and CCH and others like um, Connections on the state budget request. But obviously, housing deals with a whole range of issues, everything from homelessness, rental housing, homeownership, fair housing. There's bills that get introduced on all those and other um, topics. A big issue in the General Assembly for the last handful of years has been on reforming the Illinois state property tax system, particularly related to people with delinquent property taxes. Our interest is mostly in low-income homeowners who get behind on their taxes get sold to a private tax buyer. And then under Illinois law, as is in the case in many other states, if you get so behind on your property taxes and never pay off your debt, you can actually lose um, your home. And there's a Supreme Court case, Tyler v. Hennepin from, I believe, 2023, maybe it was 2024, that basically said the system in Illinois and some other states was unconstitutional because in those very unfortunate situations where people were losing their home or other property, they weren't being compensated for their remaining equity. So and this took multiple years ever since that Supreme Court case. There's been various bills proposed in the General Assembly. I think this year from different legislators of different political parties. There was like half a dozen or so bills with various ideas about how to address this. But Illinois finally came into compliance. I won't go into all the details, but or a couple of important things from the bill that passed that we think are really important is Illinois actually went beyond that, not just to comply with the specifics of the Supreme Court case, but actually change policies that are focused on prevention. So people, if they do get behind on their property taxes, it'll be easier to redeem through payment plans and interest fee waivers in many cases. So that this worst case scenario happens to many fewer people. And then also, a real crucial reform is we're actually in Cook County over the next 5 or 6 years going to be phasing out private tax buying, which has created a lot of the profit motive and injustices in the system. So we're glad about that uh, reform. And that was a bill that went under a lot of negotiations because there was the government interest, the tax purchaser interest. We are doing the best we can with others to represent homeowner and community interests. And so that's why it took so long.
Yeah, I'm wondering, Max and Naya, if you could speak to maybe some of the other successes you all had this year.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. First off, I was talking about SHIPA's prioritization of our budget ask. In February, the governor proposed a $10 million cut for homeless services. Obviously, that is less than ideal. But working with our partners in Senator Johnson and Representative LaPointe, we were able to defeat that proposed budget cut and ensure that those $10 million did remain in funding for homeless services for this upcoming fiscal year. Additionally, we had another big legislative win, especially for those in rental housing. We passed the Rental Affordability and Fee Transparency Act, which was sponsored by Representative Nabila Syed and Senator Mike Simmons. So this is a bill that protects, bans 11 pretty common what we call junk fees. So these are fees that we've seen for things like having an online portal to pay for rent, contacting the property manager after hours, having a maintenance request after hours, things that don't seem big when you look at them individually, but they all add up. It creates a much bigger risk of housing insecurity for folks. Another big thing that we did is we have capped application fees at $50. This is huge. I've heard anecdotally from folks of, $150, $200 application fees when you are searching for an apartment or as case managers working with clients to find apartments to use housing subsidies for. These application fees can really add up because usually you have to look at least one or two different apartments in such a tight housing market. So this bill is really aimed at making the rental market a little bit more fair, a little bit more affordable for folks. I'm really proud that we were able to get that over the finish line and signed into law by Governor Pritzker.
I think one of the things that CCH, along with our partners at Illinois Partners in the Health and Human Service Coalition, really looked to over the last, 4 or 5 years, has really been focusing on how we ensure that social services are best positioned to be able to do the work that they are contracted for. Contracting with the state, particularly in the last decade, has been a bit challenging for folks. With the budget impasse, there are still organizations that are still getting their footing back. The anniversary of the General Assembly overriding the governor's, at that time, Governor Rauner's veto was, I believe, last week or the week before, and just reminiscing on how hard that was for service providers, especially smaller ones that are minority led or in women led, and just the impact on them, like being able to make payroll and to provide services. And so, out of the frustration that a lot of providers felt over that time, social service agencies and advocates came together to work on the Community Partner Fair Contracting Act. And it is made up of three pieces of legislation that we've been working on in different variations over the last couple of years. But looking at GATA, the Grant Accountability and Transparency Act, Prompt Payment Act, and then the Court of Claims Act. It ensures that there is accountability in terms of contract processing and payment timelines. It reduces the administrative burden that we see a lot of smaller organizations having to deal with, and just making sure that they're able to deliver services in the most sustainable way. This is something that we saw as critical in real time. You can see how this is going to impact folks. This act goes into Max's point about implementation or an effective date. We This doesn't go up into effect until next year, to allow the departments, because it will impact DHS, DCFS, Department of Transportation, all of these different entities, but just making sure that we are doing it in the right way, that at the end of the day, we know that providers are able to do their work and that services are, that it is not impacting service delivery.
So those are some great successes.
Can I
They,
mention one more? I'm
yeah,
so
go for it
sorry.
now.
The other one is the Fresh program. If For folks we've been talking about what's been happening at the federal level and the impact of SNAP. In this year's budget, $70 million was included for folks who are going to be pushed off or who have been pushed off of SNAP because of what is happening with HR 1. So this coalition really headed by Greater Chicago Food Depository, is going to allow like a one-time payment to households that are impacted by the changes in SNAP. It's seen as an off-ramp for folks, and so we are super excited to see that happen. And just as a, FAQ, and I can throw this into the chat, that for folks who are being rolled off of SNAP, the folks do not have to apply or do anything on their end. DHS will reach out to them, but just making sure that clients know that they shouldn't get rid of their EBT card, their link card, that the money will go on to there. And if they have gotten rid of it, just making sure that they reach out to DHS to get a new one. And that's it. Sorry for interrupting, Chris.
No, that's really helpful information. Um, and before we transition to the maybe not so optimistic part of this, I do want to just remind folks we have over 55 people here. So if you have questions, I know we've got a few in there right now that I think will naturally be answered in a moment. But we'll try and get to as many as we can. So please do throw your questions in the Q&A. So yeah, those were some great successes. Maybe let's transition to, we'll call it the ongoing work, as this year's technically not done. There's still some chance for opportunities for things to move forward. So, what are you all looking forward to continuing the work on and this fall?
Well, I can start, and I'll go back for a second too, because in my talking about the property tax sale reform, I forgot to acknowledge the work of our chief sponsors, State Senator Selena Villanueva and Representative Curtis Tarver, who are the chair of their respective revenue committees. But in terms of ongoing work, I'll start by thanking our chief sponsors on what we're calling the Community Safety Through Stable Homes Act, Senator Karina Villa, and then from close to the Connections service area or in the Connection service area, Representative Jennifer Gong Gershowitz. And we've been working with Chicago Coalition on Homelessness, and SHPA is also supportive. I think Connections is generally supportive too, on some state legislation to regulate the use of so-called crime-free housing and nuisance ordinances that I can't go fully into, but I'll just say quickly. Most larger communities of any size, once you get up above like 25,000 or 50,000 people, most every community in Illinois has something that fits the definition of a crime-free housing and nuisance ordinance, and these are very common around the country as well. And basically, they're ordinances that allow the local government, generally working in partnership with the law enforcement agency, to tell or encourage, or in some way, it results in the local government and or law enforcement contacting a property owner and saying, hey, we think this tenant in the building is a nuisance, or we think they're engaged in some criminal activity. And rather than charging people with the crime or ticketing them for a nuisance or going through the general court or enforcement process, these ordinances basically tell the landlord that they need to abate the nuisance, or there's going to be trouble with the local government that the landlord is going to experience in terms of fines or additional inspections, even getting their license to rent housing in the community taken away. And we feel these ordinances, and evidence has shown this, are very problematic. One, just on principle, they violate people's due process rights to their day in court or their ability to defend themselves. They often penalize people who are really just trying to seek emergency services. And for that reason, people who are in a domestic violence situation or have been the victim of another uh, crime often wind up getting penalized just for calling the police. And also, unfortunately, not surprisingly, enforcement has shown that these ordinances are disproportionately used against uh, people of color, particularly Black and Latino households. So we're working on legislation to regulate the use of these ordinances. We have a lot of support in the General Assembly with the help of our chief sponsors, but there's honestly has been a good deal of opposition from local governments and law enforcement groups where we're strongly and actively engaging with them in negotiations. And but we continue to work on the bill, and we are hopeful that we'll be able to pass something before the end of the 104th General Assembly session. And I'll pass it to Naya, I think, to talk about
Okay.
another bill we're working on together.
Yeah, and I see there are a couple of questions about it, so thank you all so much. So House Bill 1429, which deals with the criminalization of homelessness, it comes out of the Grants Pass v. Johnson decision, where we just it's our third year post that decision, second year, third year. Time is not real. And so, Illinois is currently second. I believe we're still second in the nation in terms of municipalities that have passed these ordinances. The decision said that it was not an Eighth Amendment violation, cruel and unusual punishment to fine, ticket, or arrest someone for experiencing homelessness. And so we saw proliferation of these ordinances across the state. And it really is, it can be somewhere as close as Rosemont, as far away as, near in Belleville, which is near East St. Louis, some places in Southern Illinois, as well as in places like Peoria. And so, what we've been attempting to do alongside our sponsor, Representative Kevin Olacall, who represents Rogers Park, Niles, and Skokie, and with the advocacy of some of his constituents, was to introduce this bill. We again have experienced a lot of opposition in terms of local control. And I work at a nonpartisan organization. I also work at an organization that doesn't receive any governmental funding. So I can say this, a lot of these policies that we are fighting against are based on a racist and unjust system, and that we see things like the crime-free nuisance ordinances happen when Black and Brown people start moving into suburban areas or places that they weren't living before. We see, as the criminalization of homelessness, this idea of these unwanted people in certain communities. And so when we talk about ending homelessness in this country, we are talking about this idea of people saying that they don't want what are seen as undesirable people in their communities. I didn't move here to see people like this. And so, they're opposed to people may be opposed to shelters. They are opposed to multi-unit dwellings. They are opposed to affordable housing. They are opposed to seeing people experiencing homelessness. They're opposed to day centers in their communities. And it's all based on this idea of people wanting to isolate themselves, or like I'm not comfortable seeing certain things. And yeah, we should be uncomfortable seeing people experiencing homelessness in the richest country in the world. And so as we work on legislation like this, we are often confronted with this idea of, well, people don't want help. My pushback on that is always, what type of help are you attempting to provide to people? Is it the help that they need? Is it the help that they want? Are we thinking about how we are underfunding all of these different social services and safety nets, whether it's our mental health services, if people are talking about, people being having substance use disorder, like are we funding those programs? Are we moving away from the criminalization of certain things? Are we ensuring that our domestic violence and sexual assault community are receiving all of the or all of the funding that they need? Because all of these things exist within the same ecosystem. And so when we talk about, not wanting to see people or that people don't want help, we should also be looking back at ourselves and saying, what in my community am I doing? Are we putting enough revenue? Are we collecting enough progressive revenue to ensure that all of people's services are able to be met? And so we are hopeful that we might be like we were not able to get across the finish line because we had opposition from organizations like the Illinois Municipal League, who created that modeling, which received police departments, the Sheriff's Association, the chiefs of police were in opposition to the legislation. We were able to get to a place of neutrality with the Northwest. Managers and mayors, we were able to get to neutral with the Illinois Parks Association, or yes, Park Association, and we want to continue working on this. Just an anecdotally, thinking about someone being arrested last July for experiencing homelessness after one of these ordinances was passed and spending a year incarcerated because they were experiencing homelessness is not a just world. And I would argue that it is cruel and unusual punishment. And so the fight does not stop with this work. We will continue during both in doing it during lame duck. We won't need that supermajority, but we will hope like we will continue to push and see if we can get something done during veto session as well.
Yeah, and from our perspective, well, first, because I think it ties in really well to what Nai was just saying, there is a question that was sent to us from our good friend Christy Wessel, about how are we going to resolve fixing the shelter shortage and increasing housing when there's a lot of communities in the state that are strongly opposed to shelters, affordable housing in general, like Nye was just speaking about. And there's a couple different ways that we can go. And frankly, we need multiple pathways to get there because there is no one golden solution. But making sure that we fund social services the way that they need to be funded is key to all of this. We cannot end homelessness. We cannot make sure that people have somewhere safe and stable to sleep at night in this state if there isn't money to make that happen. Our budget advocacy work is something that is continuous. It doesn't end when the budget passes until the day that we actually get full funding. And we don't need to push so hard to advocate for more funding, but until that day, it is a ongoing process, like Nai was saying, ensuring that the state revamps our revenue options so that we have growing funds to be able to fund homeless services and services that support our most vulnerable people in our state while not doing that on the backs of people that are already struggling. We have wealthy corporations, wealthy individuals that call our state home, and that is what progressive revenue reforms we need to be able to have the society we want. Social services should never be in a position where we're pitting, domestic violence shelters against homeless service shelters because there simply isn't enough funding to go around when we all know we need both all social service systems to be fully funded to operate properly. Just real quick, another ongoing piece of legislation that we're working on in close partnership with Chris and the team at Connections for the Homeless is HB 5394, which is looking at expanding protections for credit score discrimination when it comes to voucher holders. We've seen since I think 2 years ago, the General Assembly passed source of income protections, which meant that landlords couldn't deny you housing because you were using a housing choice voucher or any other government subsidy to help pay for that rent. We've seen an increase of these same people getting denied for having low credit scores, even though through the government subsidy, the rent is at least 70% guaranteed. We know that this is the evidence points to it being used as a loophole to get around source of income protections. They are undermining the very purpose of government subsidies for housing, which is to stabilize and increase access to safe and stable housing. This is an ongoing effort. We will probably be coming back again in spring of 2027 to continue that work forward. But for both SHPA and I know for Connections for the Homeless, this is something that we see as really vital to making sure there's equitable access to housing in our state.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that, Max. Um, so I'm gonna actually move us to the Q&A. We've gotten a lot of great questions. Thanks to Bonnie for that question about 1429 and others. And I see a lot of questions about zoning reform and NIMBYism and mayors and cities pushing back. So I'm wondering, maybe Bob, I'll throw this to you as a two-parter. One is the governor put out his build plan this year, which dealt a lot with mainly focused on missing middle housing and zoning reform for that. The Senate had a plan that they released that also dealt with zoning reform. So I'm kind of curious, in response to those questions we're getting, maybe what all was introduced, in broad strokes and where you see this moving forward going into the veto session and lame duck.
Yes, the governor's office did his proposal on the day of the State of the State speech and the budget um, address, and Housing Action Illinois reviewed it and decided to support it. We put out a statement in support along with several other groups like Impact for Equity and a handful of others. Because it's a really good, ambitious proposal to make it easier to develop affordable housing and missing middle housing for in communities throughout Illinois, and really address the overly restrictive zoning that a lot of communities have, where it's really difficult, if not impossible, to build small single family homes or build 2 flats, 3 flats, 4 flats. A lot of the smaller, slightly denser housing models that were very prominent and easily built, like in the mid 20th century and so forth, that allowed a lot of people to become homeowners and just afford housing, whether they're a renter or an owner. But in Illinois, there's a strong tradition of local control over all zoning decisions. And so while there was a lot of support, there's a lot of uncertainty, and there was admittedly a good deal of opposition. So it didn't pass. There was one big bill in the House. They broke it into 6 different bills in the Senate. And I mentioned the zoning, but there's other components too, having to deal with permitting and faith-based housing. And I won't try and explain it all here, but it was 6 different bills in the Senate. The Senate had their own housing package that had a couple elements of the build package, but then some other housing bills. So I think this is an ongoing issue with the General Assembly. I think Naya first said at the beginning of the webinar that a major theme in this year's session was affordability, like it is around the country. And so I think although this build proposal is not an affordable housing proposal the way we often talk about it. It is a proposal, and a good one, to promote more affordability in the housing market by making it easier to develop um, smaller, more affordable housing than what the private market is building on its own. So we continue to want to support the governor's office efforts, as well as members of the General Assembly who are working on this. And hopefully something can pass before the end of this General Assembly session, or not, we'll be back next year.
Yeah, certainly quite a big theme of affordability this year. I'm curious, sorry, I'll make sure I got all these. Okay, yeah, I think one of the things that came up in the questions here was about anti-displacement, and I think I was curious, your all's take on, the bills and build dealt with upzoning and abundance and how the anti-displacement efforts play into that.
Well, I can say that among I think the concerns and opposition to build as it was introduced was it was a big complex package and a lot of different moving parts. Um, there was some opposition from, I guess I'll say, the traditional, not in my backyard. Um, um, Constituencies that are more focused on like just, protecting their own property value or their own personal self-interest. But in Italy, there were also concerns and opposition from uh, advocates and residents and community groups in certain gentrifying communities, because I think of an understandable fear that this would lead to more displacement in their community. And I think some of that was based on a lack of understanding of all the different components, but some of it is real and genuine. Um, and I think and I obviously I can't speak for the governor's office, but I know there were efforts um, through looking at ways to potentially change the bill to address those concerns about displacement. Um, so I think that's an ongoing dialogue, and that's a challenging issue for Housing Action Illinois because displacement and gentrification is something we're very concerned about. But we decided to support the package because I think when you look at all of Illinois and look at all communities in our state and again around the country, exclusionary zoning historically for, ever since zoning has existed, has been one of the main impacts has been to exclude lower income people and people of color from communities. So we do have to address zoning obstacles, but we have to do it in a thoughtful way so there's not unintended consequences. And so people who have been harmed the most by exclusionary zoning don't feel like they're going to be harmed again through these types of reforms.
I think it's also important to note that the Build Act is really focused, like you said, Chris, on this missing middle piece of housing. It's focused on how do we create more market rate housing, and what needs to be acknowledged, and we all know this in our work, is that market rate housing will never be enough for extremely low income individuals, people that rely on government subsidized housing to be able to have somewhere safe and stable to live. So more is needed. SHPA is not opposed to build. It's a key feature of how we get to a place where everyone can have safe and stable housing. We need more market rate housing. But like Bob mentioned at the beginning of his comments, this isn't necessarily an affordable housing bill. It is a housing affordability bill in the long term. More needs to be done for the short term immediate needs of the people that our organizations are serving day in and day out.
Awesome. Appreciate you all for that thoughtful response. maybe before I wrap up, we've got a lot of participants here, a lot of folks that are in different parts of the state, and I'm would love for you all to share what is the best way for them to get involved. What should they be thinking about? What should they be doing? How can they get involved in all of this work?
All right. Okay, so I am a part of, I think we all are a part of so many coalitions, but I think we cannot do this work without one another. And so it's in our name, Chicago Coalition to End Homelessness. So I would say Protect Our Care Illinois, which works on Medicaid and ACA and marketplace related advocacy, both at the federal and state level. Save Our SNAP, which is a statewide advocacy organization that also mirrors what we're doing at Protect Our Care Illinois. The crime free legislation that we're working on has is in coalition as well. I don't know if our contact information was included on materials, but please feel free to reach out to us. The work we're doing on 1429, the grants pass criminalization bill, we also have a coalition around that work as well. And I know, we are member organizations. I think for CCH signing, like our comms team is, they put out just the right amount of newsletters and action alerts. But oftentimes during session, when we need witness slips, and for folks who may not know what a witness slip is, it is an opportunity for constituents who live here in the state of Illinois to say yes or no on a bill. And it's just it takes less than, if you have an account, takes less than 2 minutes. If you don't have an account, 5 minutes to just, let your legislators know what is important to you, and they're read in committee and a part of the record. And so we will often do action alerts to ask people to do witness slips or to contact their legislators, send an email that we've pre-populated with the information. But I think oftentimes with the work that we do, it is really important for our legislators to hear from us. The mayors or the business owners in their communities who, have their cell phone numbers, tell them to vote no on something. But it's just as important for their constituency to be sending emails and to call their offices to let them know, because they will say, well, I didn't hear from anyone. And we want to make sure that that is not something they can say. And that if they vote in opposition to something that is in the best interest of their community, that they know that their community is watching.
I'll also say, on top of everything Naya said, because she's an expert at this, one of the most effective ways that you can, if you're new to advocacy, if you're looking to step up your efforts in advocacy, is look at your local level. If you're city council or village board of trustees, that is the local level is where some of the hardest barriers to overcome for receiving housing services, homeless services, access to shelter. A lot of the barriers that exist are because of local policies. And at the local level, it is often, 5 or 10 people that are upset and angry that can kill legislation and good policies. And it is so important that we have people advocating for homelessness, for ending homelessness, for homeless services, for access to housing, because those are voices that across the state of Illinois, people on their local city councils aren't hearing enough from. So that is a super impactful way to engage in your advocacy work is at your local city or town.
Awesome. Thank you both for that. We are now exactly at time, so I will try and wrap this real quickly here. Want to appreciate everyone for joining us today. As a reminder, we'll send the slides, or we didn't have slides today, so we will not be sending slides. We will send the recording of this out to you all, and include contact information, as Naya mentioned, so that you guys can get a hold of us. And as we move into next session, we plan to do more of these. So look out for these in the future to try and get involved and hear what's happening from these experts. And also want to appreciate Naya, Max, and Bob for joining us and taking the time out of their day, and sharing their expertise. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that at Connections, we got our block party coming up in short order, in I believe 11 days, next weekend, the following weekend. And feel free to register for that, join us, and get involved. With that, I will wrap us up. Thank you all for joining us today.